What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to Lemaster Tech, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to do basic error and exception handling in Python. Okay, so Python error or exception handling, you'll probably hear both as you spend a lot of time writing programming, but error and exception handling is essentially creating a robust Python program that you try to set up to anticipate certain common failings or scenarios you know you're going to run into, and tell your code what to do in the event of these different scenarios. It breaks down essentially into try, except, else, and finally, these sort of four commands. And try is basically the code operation to attempt. Okay, that should be pretty logical. Except is the scenarios that could happen that are not ideal. So essentially, whatever code you try, you make except rungs to basically say, well, if this happens, do this. If this happens, do this. So it's essentially different scenarios you could foresee happening. Else is what to do if the try code works. And then finally, will run regardless of try working or flagging exceptions. Okay, so that right there is a 1-minute explanation of what you need to understand about error handling in Python. Try, except, else, and finally. And now to kind of give you an example of that code, let's go ahead and use the example of a game just booted up and you want to load in the highscore.txt file to tell you what your player's high score is. So let's start by saying the highscore.txt file just has a row that says 100 in it, okay? So the code to try, and you call this by sort of starting with try and then colon. The code we want to try is going to be file equals open high_score.txt. And basically, what we're saying is if the game has been played before, this file should exist. We should have a file that stores our player's high score in it. Okay, so that's what we're going to try. But then what we have to do is say except, and then here's where you would put the exception you want to check for. You can just put generic exception here, like Python supports the word exception with a capital E, but this is a very broad term. And if you have PyCharm or an advanced Python IDE, it'll even probably tell you something like too broad of an exception clause. Okay, but at a baseline, this is going to tell you something went wrong. Okay, so basically these are the first two steps, try and except. And now let's say that it wasn't looking for a file that we had. It was looking for high score with no underscore, because I do have high_score. But so here we have highscore.txt with no underscore. So if I try to run this, it's going to go ahead and tell me something went wrong, but it doesn't tell me what went wrong. So here's where getting more specific in your exception handling can actually be better. So one of the most common things might be file not found, and there's actually a built-in file not found error. So here you could print the file was not found. Okay, so then if I ran this, it tells me the file was not found. So it gets a little better at telling me what the error actually is. And you could still do a catch-all after that. So you could say except exception like this, and you could print something went wrong down here, but basically you need to make sure that the more generic exception handling is after the more specific exception handling. And if you need a list of all the built-in exceptions, you can find them online. And you can also flag an exception manually, which basically means if you see certain parameters, you can flag an exception and say, oh, that's not supposed to happen. Like if you're ever dividing by 0 before trying to calculate slope or something, you could say, as long as I'm not dividing by 0. So I'm not going to get too much into the weeds of all the different exception clauses you could have, but understand here when we run this, it says the file not found. But then if I found the file and I had something else like a bad reading was equal to files instead of file, then my exception handling is going to throw something went wrong. And it's not going to throw that the file was not found, because it was. So our second exception clause, which is just sort of a catch-all, is going to detect that there was a bad file. And something else that's kind of nice is you can store this exception in like a temporary variable. Like in this case, I'll just say as E. And then I'm going to print out E. And Python supports this. Every exception has a built-in sort of explanation of what the exception is. So now name files is not defined is what this exception is throwing. And if I were to try the file not found error, it's going to tell me no such file or directory as highscore.txt. Okay, so if you don't want to take the time and type out your own error messages and exception messages, you can print just whatever Python says the exception was right here. I find this to be pretty useful unless you're doing advanced programs where it means something very specific to you, the programmer, when that error occurs. Okay, so we don't need that anymore, and let's go ahead and point this back to the file we have. Now let's say what to do else. So if it works, right? We try to open the file. Let's say else we are going to print file.read. And you could say, well, couldn't you put this in try? Like, wouldn't you want to try to open the file and then print file.read? And that's actually up to the programmer's sort of judgment, because if what we want to do with this exception handling is say if the file doesn't exist, we want to create it, or we want to let the player know that the file doesn't exist. If the file does exist, we want to read from it. Or you could say if the file doesn't exist or we can't read from it, we want to throw an exception. It's actually up to the programmer, but I'm going to put it down here in the else statement, okay? So now it should just give us 100, right? We don't have an error. We found the file, it was able to open the file, and we have 100, which is great. And so the last section to talk about is finally, which is going to run no matter what. So whether we have an exception or not. And so in finally, let's go ahead and do print routine finished. Okay, so no matter what, if we have an error, if we don't, routine finished is going to print. So if I run again, you'll see we get 100, and then we get routine finished. If I flag an error, if I delete the underscore again and I run it, you'll see we get no such file or directory as highscore.txt, but the routine's still finished, okay? So that's the point of finally. No matter what, it's gonna run. So the most common use of something in finally is like severing a connection. So if you had an established connection to like a database or a file or something, you could put your like file.close in the finally code. So no matter what, you're closing that connection. You're ending that tie to a database that you had. All right, so let's take a look at what if we wanted to do something other than just print out what the exception was. If we had the file not found error, what if we wanted to actually make the file? Well, then we could say file equals open and then high_score.txt and then W, which means we want to write to it. That's what the W means. And then you do a file.write, and then this has to be a string, but we're going to go ahead and say, let's write a 0, because this means we've never played this game before. We don't even have the highscore.txt file created. So let's do file.write and just put a 0 in there. And then file.close, okay? So now we've made it. And let's print highscore file created, okay? So how do we know if this works? Well, let's go ahead and delete the highscore.txt file from our project library. So now you can see I don't have highscore.txt in my folder anymore, which means when I run this, it should see that there's a file not found error, and it should create that file. It should essentially open it, but it's going to see it doesn't exist, so it'll generate it. It's going to write a 0 to it, and then it's going to close it. So let's go ahead and run that. All right, so you can see it tells us no such file or directory because we left the print E in there. So the highscore file was created and then the routine was finished. Now I'm gonna open it up and you can see we have a 0 in there, all right? So if I change this to 100, run this again, this time you just get 100 and then routine finished because now it created the file that we were looking for. So if you can kind of keep in your mind, try, except, else, finally, and then you sort of can remember generically what those 4 things mean, you're going to be fine to understand Python error handling. Those are at the core of exception handling. And so this is maybe a very specific scenario, like this scenario of looking for a file that doesn't exist yet and then creating it. But I think the broader concept here is very useful. So I hope you found that useful. If you have any questions about what you saw in this video or requests of things you'd like to see in the future on the channel, be sure to let me know about them in the comments below. Don't forget to leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. That sort of support helps me out a ton. As always, thanks for watching. Good luck with your projects, and until next time, bye.